Thank you, Malik. I'm honored to be moderating this panel and to serve as an advisory council member for Act to Change. Today, we'll be focusing on enhancing education from an activist perspective. The reality is that in far too many of our communities, many of our educators are left without resources and guidance in teaching about the experiences, history, and power of the AAPI and other marginalized communities. While we demand inclusion in our school curriculums nationwide, what other tools can we use at our immediate disposal to help educate our youth? Joining me today are 4 AAPI activists who have effectively used their platform to make strides in this space, and I'm excited to see what's in store for them. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Jose Antonio Vargas, Sheetal Sheth, Liz Kleinrock, and Hāwane Rios. Welcome, everyone. Jose, I'd love to start with you. Thanks again for joining us today. I feel more than any of us, you know firsthand the power of storytelling to not just change our hearts and minds, but also drive advocacy and action. While anti-Asian hate isn't anything new, we're in a unique moment where after years of feeling invisible or erased, for better or worse, many Asian Americans now feel a sense of hypervisibility, particularly with all the coverage and conversation now of public anti-Asian attacks. What do you think caused this shift in national attention, and how do you see it supporting advocacy and reform in our education system?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's really great to be amongst all of you. And I'm just sad that I have to answer that question in this way, which is that the reality is, I'm here in the Bay Area where the attacks have been really nonstop, right? You've heard about elderly Asian women. You've heard about so many people, so many Asian people from different ethnicities and different age groups just really being attacked. A few weeks ago, I remember there was an Instagram post that said, "Slap an Asian if you're on BART," which is like our transportation system here in the Bay, here in the East Bay. And my nephews and nieces, all of whom are late teens, early 20s, started texting the group text. And one of my nephews was like, "I'm gonna slap back." And that's when I started getting really nervous about what this could really look like, right? And really nervous about the safety of not just my nieces and nephews, but my grandma, my Lola, which is grandma in Tagalog, and my aunties and my titas and my titos and everybody. So I think the level of violence that we're seeing, and in some ways, a friend of mine just reminded me that they've actually always been there. The difference, of course, is now video is catching them, right? And so how can we use this moment to not just address stop hating Asians, stop Asian hate, which has been kind of a dominant hashtag, and actually just talk about the context and the history behind all of this, right? And then how do we get to this question of we have always belonged in this country, right? And for me, I have to say the last thing the point that I want to say is, from as far as I can remember, and I've been in this country since '93, I don't remember this kind of pan-Asian moment ever really happening, where I feel like it doesn't matter if the people who are being attacked are, Indian, Vietnamese, Filipino, Chinese, Korean. For the first time, I feel like there's this identification of, that's my aunt, that could be my grandma, that could be my mom. And I think that's a really powerful sense of community.
Thanks for sharing that, Jose. I've been feeling also similarly buoyed by that and empowered, just seeing that sense of camaraderie and community in action and solidarity across the nation. I also have a follow-up question for you. I have admired the various ways in which you've been vocal about your own immigration status. And you founded Define American with the idea that citizenship is about community, not paperwork. Of course, this might be a difficult topic to broach with our youth, but we do know that kids understand fairness and equity early on. I'm wondering what advice you'd give to your younger self or any other youth who is undocumented, come from a mixed status family or a multi-generational family that might be watching today. What can allies and co-conspirators be doing to support them?
I mean, I think for me, I mean, I would not have had a career, in journalism, if I didn't have mentors, right? If I didn't have people in my life who defined what freedom is for somebody who doesn't have legal status or don't have the right papers. And I don't know, for example, when immigration reform is going to happen, right? Like, unfortunately, both political parties are responsible for the mess that we're in. Republicans more so than Democrats, absolutely. Um, so I don't know how long I need to wait for Congress to get its act together to get quote unquote papers and to be legal and to be free. So while that's happening, however long that takes, the advice I give a lot of people is, how do you surround yourself with people who will make you feel free, right?
Mm.
Like, if freedom can't come from the government, then it must come from the people who you surround yourself with, right? Like, in some ways, those are the people that are going to open windows when doors are shut. When people say you can't get a license, because you can't get a driver's license because you live in the state of Texas, or you can't apply for that scholarship for that grant because you're undocumented and you aged out of DACA, maybe, whatever that may be, right? And so allyship is real to me. There are many people in my life who don't even use the word allies, who are allies and who have been in many ways sources of freedom. So that will be the big advice is find those people, hold on to them, right? In some ways, like, they can create an America where you belong, right? And it's more than just pieces of papers and laws.
Thank you, Jose. Hāwane, I'd love to pivot to you. Thank you so much for joining us today as well. I'd love to ask you for your thoughts on how to drive change in our education system as well. Your advocacy work for the Protect Mauna Kea movement and your life work as a musician is so beautifully connected with one another and grounded in knowledge of what our ancestors have survived. Can you speak a little bit about your connection to your community and why it's so important to know our history as marginalized people who stand in solidarity? And I also understand that your mom, whom I'm a huge fan of, Auntie Puakis, is a leader in her own right and was a classroom teacher for many years. Can you talk about the relationship between education and activism you've learned from her and through your own work? Can you speak to any dissonance, if any, that was experienced there?
Velina Mai Mekelo Hanui, mahalo for inviting me into this space and mahalo for these questions. I watched my mom as I grew up in and out of the classroom. She was the Hawaiian Studies teacher at Waimea Middle School. And from when I was small, I had this i'ini, this desire to know about where I come from. And that comes from the way that my mom teaches. It comes from the way that she lives her teachings. And so I watched her speak of our mo'oku auhau, our genealogy as a people. And I feel so grateful that that information, that knowledge, that wisdom, that ancestral knowing was saved for us by the ones who came before, because so many people do not know where they come from because that was stolen from them. And so to know where I come from through mo'oku auhau, that right there was the pai honua of my entire life, the foundation of my existence. And so I thank my mom for teaching me this and teaching so many of our community through this way of art and chant, dance, singing. I learned through these mediums, and I saw all of these kids, going into this program with my mom. I saw them come home to themselves because they knew where they come from through the movement of their body, through chanting, through singing their existence into this space that we are living in, where we are marginalized, we are the minorities in our own home. And so this was empowering, and it still is. And as a resource teacher now, I've followed in my mother's footsteps. And I've gone into many classrooms, and this is the way that I've learned to connect and learn to teach, is by inviting our people to learn through the medium of connection that our ancestors passed down to us. And so I always say, somebody never stopped chanting, somebody never stopped speaking our language, somebody never stopped being proud to be Kanaka Oiwi, to be Hawaiian. And all of these things is a part of our legacy as a people. And so one thing that I learned from my mom is she always spoke the truth. She never hid anything from her students. There's so many things happening out in Hawaii, so many issues. We have an issue for every second of the day. And now with social media, now with the amount of information that is on this platform, our students, our kids are seeing what's happening. And so we can't hide from them. And so what I do, especially when I'm talking about Mauna Kea, is I don't hide what's happening on the front line. I don't hide what's happening in the contested cases. They have a right to know and a right to make their own decisions about how they feel about what is happening to our homelands. And so grounding the space in, very simple things like, what is the name of your mountain? What is the name of your river? What is the name of your parents, your grandparents? Do you know the genealogy that you have to your homeland? These are the very foundational practices that we use in the classroom so that they will care and continue to care about where they come from and their kuleana to land and to space and place. And so, yeah, that is what we do here in Hawaii Island and with the Mauna Kea Education and Awareness Hui. And I'm so happy to share some of that with all of you. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo, Hāwane. Thank you so much for the incredible ways that you continue to speak truth to power, be a model for our youth. As you were speaking, it was just also making me think about this quote that when one must speak, silence when one must speak is the slow death of freedom. We all want our children and all of our relatives to be free. So many thanks to you. Liz, I've been a huge fan of your work. I follow you on Insta at Teach and Transform. Your workshop on navigating difficult conversations as part of one of Act to Change's classroom combos last year was so powerful. We're really grateful to have you back with us again today. We've heard from many API parents who have realized just how much they weren't taught about their own histories and are trying to make sure their children in the next generation don't have the same experience. What are some tools you think parents can use to teach their kids, and perhaps even more importantly, their friends about API history? In that same vein, how can we encourage kids to be accomplices or co-conspirators in promoting equity for marginalized communities as opposed to mere allyship?
Thank you so much for the question, Sarah, and thank you, Act to Change, for having me back. It's been such a great opportunity to be able to connect with so many other Asian American Pacific Islander educators and activists in this space. I feel like there's a lot of layers to that, but also wanting to just be mindful of the space that I'm taking up with all these other incredible folks. I feel like I can break it down into strategies and also resources that are available. Because I feel like on one hand, when information is new to us, we kind of have a tendency to want to reinvent the wheel, but there's a lot of information that's out there, but oftentimes it's really hard to locate it or figure out where to look or try to compile the best of resources that currently exist. So on a very practical hand, there are a couple of organizations such as Learning for Justice and Embrace Race that offer really practical tools, sentence starters and questions you can use to engage with students and especially with young kids. So that information is already out there, which is really beautiful. I think from the perspective of as an Asian American who knew pretty much nothing about her history, especially being a transracial adoptee, being born in South Korea, but being raised in a white family here in the States, I feel like I experienced erasure on multiple levels. And even despite, as a product of the US education system, I can think of maybe the two things I ever learned about anyone Asian in my classroom, which were, learning about how Chinese immigrants helped build the railroads and that Japanese Americans were put into camps during World War II. And that's where it began and ended. So I feel like a lot of the education that I've had to do, and I've heard from other Asian American and Pacific Islander educators and colleagues, is first like having to sit with and deal with some of the rage and anger and loss that we have been robbed of our own history in the spaces that are supposed to be ours. And I know that for a lot of educators out there and parents, you kind of feel the need to become an expert in a particular subject or topic before you have the comfort level of interacting with kids and talking about certain issues. But I also feel like, on the other hand, it's too urgent, and that can also take forever. Like, you can sit in the intellectualization realm for a very, very long time. So the way that I can think about it with my students is, if there is something that I don't know about, but I do believe it's important for them to engage in, how can I look at this instead as a joint opportunity for us to learn together? That when we think about collaboration, we often think of it as adult with adult instead of having partnership and collaboration between adult and young people. I think like the number one question that I will ask my students around any topic is just, what do you think you know, and what are you curious about? And once we have those questions out, our questions might actually be really aligned with each other. How can we then try to identify resources and figure out ways where we can co-construct our knowledge and understanding together? So I think one really practical tool for parents and caregivers and educators is just to get really comfortable with saying, I don't know, when a young person asks you a question, and how can we figure out that answer together? I would also say that it's so important to make sure that we're also balancing both like the positive and negative sides of history, because the examples that I gave of what I learned in school about Asian American history were such from a deficit lens, just like people don't want to be defined by the worst things that have been done to them. There were no examples of like power or joy or resilience or culture or anything. All of that was erased. So while it is super important for us to know our history, and that does include history of racism that we have experienced, of marginalization and oppression and injustice, how can we also elevate stories of who we are and how we want people to define us instead? And to the second question around how do we have kids learn to go from being allies to being more active accomplices or co-conspirators, is thinking about how we can model this practice for ourselves and for our students. Like, how are we actually living these values in a way that our children and our students can see the behavior, see the type of language that we want them to display and demonstrate as well. And to think about different situations that we could present to students, how they have felt in particular situations. When have there been times when people have spoken up for them? When have there been times when people have ignored pain or hardship that they've gone through? To really remind ourselves that we have to be rooted in relationships and empathy and community for any of this to really matter.
Thank you so much, Liz, for the continued wisdom that you drop in this community, and the tangible actions as well as resources that you shared in your response. Sheetal, your first book, Always Anjali, was one of the first of its kind, a picture book that addressed a problem many API kids have encountered, feeling different because they don't have a traditional white American name. You also were given advice to change your name when you started acting, which I'm sure was a very difficult decision because of what was traditionally thought about media at the time. For many API parents reading your book, it felt like this was the first time someone acknowledged the situation. Can you tell us how the book came about and what the reaction was from Asian and non-Asian folks? You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's so nice to be in this space with everybody and listening to everyone speak. There's so much that resonates with me and actually with your question. And that the books came from, I've been an actress for over 20 years. I love telling stories. I think of myself as a storyteller. I've worked extensively with kids through my whole life. And I was pregnant with my first daughter at the time, and I was looking for books like most parents. And what I found was very much what I found in most of media as an actress and things I saw out there. And it was obviously very white. And if there was something that had to do with brown people, especially specifically South Asian, it was either culturally insensitive or culturally inaccurate. And I found that most of the stories centered around narratives that were kind of extraordinary events. Like you would just see books about us having Diwali and Holi and Ramadan. Like there was nothing else. And it made me crazy because I felt like we have dinner with our parents, we have pets, we play sports, we do all the things all the other kids do, but we're not allowed to have books about just being kids and the narrative not centered around race. And so I, was like, I'm not going to complain about it. I'm just going to do something about it. And, I started writing, and Always Anjali was inspired by kind of my childhood and actually, unfortunately, my adulthood, and so many stories that I have heard and what I've experienced. I have lost jobs because I refused to change my name. There are several instances, maybe one day I'll talk about that. That'll be in the book one day, about some major movies. And this was ages ago, but still, that told me if I didn't change my name, I couldn't get the job. And it alarmed me how many times that came up and continued to come up. And I thought, my God, if that's happening to me, what is happening to our children? And I just thought we need to teach kids that they're perfect exactly the way they are. And by the way, our names are given to us for a reason, and we are born into them as much as we create who we are through them. And it's something to be celebrated. And I just always felt like to erase that part of yourself to, quote, fit in, made me really sad. And something that, I experienced even when I was creating this book and shopping it. It's interesting because I deliberately wanted it to be about, a brown girl, clearly, but living life. So many publishers would be like, not Indian enough. And I would say, what does that mean to you? What is that like? And again, it comes to this idea of the narratives. I still think, when you see in media, when it comes to South Asian representation, which a lot of people don't even realize is Asian, there's another conversation. We get a few stories. We get arranged marriage, we get terrorism, we get mythology, we get religion. If we're lucky, we get, some token, side character. But those are the stories that people see us as. And so when they say it's not Indian enough, it's because I haven't fulfilled one of those boxes. And my point is, I don't think we're ever going to feel like we're part of the kind of majority community if we're not able to tell stories about the mundane as we do as much about the extraordinary.
Thank you so much. And it's interesting, in some ways, your remarks were just pointing to how your book is proving some of the practices that Liz even elevated regarding how no one is too young to learn about fairness, equity, celebration of differences, and celebrating narratives that are centered in joy and our resistance of and existence. I love that the book is now becoming a series with Bravo Anjali coming out later this year. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'll tell you. So, and I'll just, to pivot on what you just said about what Liz was saying, I did get pushback because there are moments, and for me, I agree with Liz. I don't think you're too young to have any conversation. I think obviously putting it in the right context and language is important, but I feel like what better place but in your parents' lap or in a classroom around people who love you than to have these conversations. And so there are moments in all of my books that people aren't used to seeing in children's books, but they're there for a reason, because I want these conversations to happen. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere unless, like Jose was saying, until we get people, when they're younger. And yes, and so it is a series. And I will say this, it was shocking to me that this is the only illustrated book series in this age group that features a South Asian hero. Not surprising, but shocking. And so, the second book coming out, because the first book has done tremendously well, only tells you how there is such hunger for this content and that people want this. And, the school, not just in homes, but the schools are teaching it. It makes me so happy. And the next book is Bravo Anjali, and we're going to see her dealing with something else. And it's another specific conversation that I think is important that we all have. And in this one, it deals with her being the only girl in the room and how she deals with that.
Thank you for that. I am definitely signing up to making sure that that gets on the bookcase of my 8-month-old. It's never too
Yes.
young.
Yes. Well, I think it's about also, like, people say to me, I have a baby. I go, exactly. So get books that show the world to your baby the way that it is. So it's up to us to expose them to images, community, family structures, like as babies, because they get that. They're looking at that, and that should be the norm for them.
That's right. Well, that is a really great segue to the next question for everyone on this panel. We know that the Asian and Pacific Islander community is so incredibly vast and diverse. And I think it's important to name that just because we're having this conversation about uplifting APIA communities, particularly in education, it doesn't mean we can't also talk about the differences that so often get erased under the umbrella of our very diverse diaspora. I'd like to close by asking each of you to share, what do you want to uplift and share about your APIA experience that you want our educators, parents, and leaders to spend more time thinking about? And we could start with Liz.
Sure, thanks. I think the number one thing that I would hope that people could walk away with is recognizing, even just based on the diversity of this panel, that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not monolithic, not in the slightest way. There is not a single person from our joint community that I can think of who hasn't had some experience with feeling imposter syndrome in some way, feeling like you have to fit into a particular box. But our diaspora is enormous and diverse, and our stories are as well. And I would hope that people can just remember that there is no one way to be Asian American or to be Pacific Islander.
I'll jump in because it kind of relates to what Liz is saying, in that when I think about teachers and parents, because they have this amazing opportunity to shape children's lives and minds, is to that point, you know, it's okay if you have 10 books. It's okay if 10 of them are people of color. It doesn't have to be like one white, one black, one Latin, like, which I often see, because what happens when you do that is you end up picking that like tokened book that has to deal with that thing, like I mentioned before, that usually is around a narrative associated with a cultural identity. And I think it's really important, as Liz said, because we're not a monolithic community, to show us doing all of the things, because we all do.
I just want to say, just as a reminder, that we are all connected by the ocean and we're not separated by it. And that we all come from sacred genealogies, sacred ancestors and rituals and ceremonies and belief systems. And that we all can tap into that mana, that power, that knowing of that we are worthy. That where we come from is special, and that, you know, the more that we unite, the more we tell our stories together, the more we share in spaces like this, the more our keiki, our next 7 generations, will see that we did the work to connect, we did the work to unite, and that we're going to continue to do this sacred commitment to setting a good pathway for them. And so thank you again for having me. Mahalo piha from Hawaii Nui Akea.
I just wanted to add that, you know, I don't know if you can see the portrait of Toni Morrison behind me. And as everybody was talking, I just kept thinking that I want people to kind of keep in mind that there's a bigger picture here, which is that collectively we are rewriting the master narrative of America and American history and who belongs and who gets to define who an American is in this country. That was Toni Morrison's work that deeply impacted me when I was in 8th grade here, reading The Bluest Eye. And living through what we're living through now, I feel like the commonality of all these movements, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Latinx movement around, you know, looking at the border and ICE in a totally different way, all of that is about rewriting the master narrative of America, and that we have a role to play in doing that.
Thank you all so much for the gift of your wisdom. I really appreciate you joining us today for this powerhouse panel discussion. I'm so grateful to share space with all of you and have your support in helping Act to Change commemorate May 18th. Thank you so much, and looking forward to staying connected.